Now, victims of the Tainted Blood scandal could sue the government over claims of a potential cover-up. Last month, we revealed that victims of the scandal, one of the worst in the history of the NHS, were still fighting for answers 30 years after thousands of patients were given blood transfusions that were contaminated, and they were later diagnosed with HIV and hepatitis. It happened in the 70s and 80s. More than 2,000 have since died, and many more have had their lives ruined. Now, BBC Panorama tonight reveals that one of the victims' children is taking legal action against the government. And if he's successful, the case could be used to help others who were affected. Jason Evans' father, Jonathan, had severe haemophilia and was given a blood clotting treatment.
Patients should have been given the choice of whether they wanted to take that gamble and play Russian roulette with their life. And I can almost guarantee you that 99% of them would not have taken that gamble. My mum was with him and they were called in to the doctor's office, and the doctor basically told them both quite bluntly that my dad had tested positive for HIV.
Tony Ferrugia was just 14 years of age when his father, Barry, died of AIDS as a result of that NHS treatment. Tony told our reporter Jim Reed about the last time he saw his dad.
I do remember my dad asking me for some of my ice cream, and I handed it to him, at which point one of the nurses intervened and said, "You can't give him that." I was like, "Why?" He had blisters in his mouth that were bleeding, so obviously I couldn't share an ice cream with my dad because they'd given him AIDS. I just found it, looking back on it now, at the time I didn't think too much into it, but looking back over it, I was disgusted. You know, that I couldn't... I did have physical contact with my dad. I'd give him a hug. You know, I said goodbye.
Barry Ferrugia's death in 1986 split the family apart. Tony went back into care. His twin brother David went to a separate care home in North London. The whole family were only reunited 24 years later.
2nd of August 2010 was the first time all our family were in the same room. You know, that group of brothers, that's what they did. You know, they destroyed my dad with these viruses, and then they watched his family crumble.
Well, let's speak now to Michelle Tolley. Hepatitis C has given Michelle cirrhosis of the liver, which can cause cancer. She's now being treated, but the damage that's already been done could prove fatal. We'll also talk again to Andy Evans, who was infected with HIV at 5 years old and later hepatitis when receiving treatment for his haemophilia on the NHS. And in a moment we'll hear from Andy Burnham, the recently elected Labour Mayor of Greater Manchester, who's called this a cover-up. Michelle, how do you react to this development that the child of one of the victims is now taking legal action against the government?
Yes, good morning, Victoria.
Morning.
Yes, it needs to be done. It's bad that it's been a cover-up. It's bad that so many people have been infected, either by giving whole bloods or the factor VIII serum. The devastating effect that it's had on my life, the impact on my family, and I'm sure I can speak for other community sufferers. It's devastating, it's horrific.
And you only found out that you had hepatitis C in 2015. As far as I understand it, you're the most recently diagnosed of those who had blood transfusions back, you know, several years ago. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, I had 2 blood transfusions before the blood was screened, one in 1987 and then one in February 1991. Some adverts came onto the television regarding hepatitis C and blood transfusions, and in the sort of mid-90s I went to my GP at the time to inquire about the tests, etc., and was basically sent away saying, "Don't be silly, you won't have that." So trusting my GP, being a young mum of 4, I trusted him, went away and carried on with my life. It's a very slow, progressive disease that hides its way in many, many shapes or forms. And I'd got to kind of November 2015 and I knew there was just something very, very wrong. It was by chance that I'd had my diabetic yearly test and my liver functions was showing very, very high. So I was called in by my GP, and it was just through generally chatting to him that I'd suddenly remembered about the blood transfusions. So he tested me there and then, and the next day I found out, and it tore my world apart. Absolutely tore my world apart. I started to plan my own funeral. I thought I was going to die. I cannot even put into words how I feel and how it's affected us, and for other people. I've struggled to try and find out, because like I say, it's only just been 18 months. My brain's been like a sponge trying to soak up all the information about this. I would actually like to make a point to Andy Burnham and ask him that he's got a responsibility, a duty of care, if you like, to hand his evidence over to the police. I really don't think he should wait.
OK, well, let's bring in Mr Burnham now. Good morning.
Thank you.
You've been campaigning on behalf of victims for some time now. Do you have some evidence that you can hand over to the police?
Morning, Victoria.
Morning.
Yes, I believe I have evidence of crimes that have been committed against the victims of contaminated blood. Now, if people remember, going back, if you look at the parallel with Hillsborough, I had evidence of amended police statements back at the beginning when we began to open up Hillsborough. Now, in my view, if I were to go straight to the police with that evidence, I'm not sure we'd get to the full truth as quickly as possible. And what I first want to do is give the government the chance to set up a Hillsborough-style inquiry into what went wrong originally and the cover-up that subsequently followed. Now, if they don't do that, the new government after the election, then I will go to the police. So I've made that very clear to them. Okay. Unless they establish a Hillsborough-style inquiry after the election, whoever that government is, I will go to the police by the time the House rises for the summer recess. And the way I'm putting it in that way is because I believe an individual police investigation into individual cases won't necessarily get us quickly to the full truth, and that is what the victims deserve.
Understood. And let me ask you, without you naming names or getting into trouble legally, what is it that you believe you have evidence of?
Well, I believe this goes back to willful negligence by the state in the first instance. So there were warnings coming out of America about the quality of these blood products. They were basically ignored. And there is documentary evidence to say that actually they were actively tested on patients, even though the risks were known. So that was the first piece of evidence. The next is evidence of tests being done on people for hepatitis C, for HIV, without the knowledge of those individuals. Evidence of results of those tests not being communicated to those individuals, even when they were positive. And in some ways, what I find most shocking of all, deliberate falsification of people's medical notes to suggest that the liver disease was self-inflicted through alcoholism and not a result of contaminated blood products. So plenty of evidence, Victoria, on many levels of both willful negligence by the state and then, I would argue, a cover-up on an industrial scale. OK.
Let me bring in Andy Evans, Michelle, Tolley and Andy Burnham. Mr Evans, how do you react, first of all, to what Mr Burnham's just said?
When Andy Burnham, hi Andy, stood up
Andy.
in Parliament and uttered those words, I saw it as a breakthrough moment for our campaign. We've been waiting for somebody to say that sort of thing.
And do you think he's right to say, give a new government chance to establish a Hillsborough-style public inquiry? If that doesn't happen, then Mr Burnham takes what he has to the police?
I think so. I think Hillsborough and the subsequent cases that followed Hillsborough have proven to be successful in their aims. And so I trust Andy Burnham when he says that a Hillsborough-style inquiry would be the best way to go on this. Okay. Although, obviously, you know, a proper statutory public inquiry with the ability to compel witnesses under oath and unearth documents would be also, you know, very welcome.
You contracted HIV aged 5.
Yes.
That was 1982. You were told about your HIV diagnosis aged 12.
Yes.
That later developed into AIDS.
Yeah.
Can you give our audience a sense of what it is like to discover something like that and then live with it?
In a sense, I can't really describe it because it's all I've ever known. You know, I from 12 years old, I knew that I was HIV positive, and when you're a teenager, you're invincible. So, you know, you acclimatise yourself to that. But obviously later on in my life, when I developed full-blown AIDS at 16, I was in and out of hospital. I was expected to die on several occasions. My parents were given, you know, the final infection notice on several occasions. You know,
meaning you were about to die?
Yes, yes, indeed, yeah. And then, of course, the devastating effects that it's got as far as the stigma is concerned, and the way it affects your relationships. And then, of course, ever since then, the very toxic medications that we all have to take on a daily basis, not just for the HIV, but the incredibly toxic hepatitis C treatments as well. They do wreck your body. I mean, I don't think I'm even you know, coming out of being classed as having full-blown AIDS 20 years later, that I've properly recovered from any of that yet.
Right. Andy Burnham, give us, I mean, we've reported on this last month when we reported about how many people were still affected, still finding out, still discovering new information. How big a scandal do you believe this is?
I think it's a scandal on a momentous scale, Victoria. Honestly, I do. I mean, thousands and thousands of people affected, not just directly, but their families too, suffering in silence over decades, forced to beg for scraps of financial help from the government, but never being given the truth about what happened and why it happened. You know, really left in the darkest of wildernesses over many, many years. And there's been lots of well-meaning MPs who've tried to help, but nobody has really moved it forward, because, as we saw with Hillsborough, unless you start with the truth, tell people the truth about what happened, only when you establish the truth can you then begin to get real justice. And I think it's because the country doesn't know really what happened to these victims. There's never been that groundswell of support that's come in behind them and then demanded adequate recompense and justice from the government. And so I hope that this Panorama programme tonight might begin to break the dam, as we had with Hillsborough in those years after the 20th anniversary of the memorial service. Yeah. I think something similar needs to happen here, Victoria. The country needs to know this story and how scandalous it is, because I know the British people, when they do know it, they will come in behind these victims and they will demand truth and justice for them. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming on the programme. Andy Burnham. Michelle, many thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank
Michelle
you.
Tolley and Andy Evans again. Thank you.
Thank you.
And you can watch Panorama, Contaminated Blood, The Search for the Truth, at 9 o'clock tonight on BBC One and after on BBC iPlayer.